All right, we carry on in the book of Acts. As we saw last week, if I have this thing turned on, yes, we saw last week, after having beaten and imprisoned Paul and Silas, the magistrates in Philippi, they were informed that they had done that illegally because Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, and that led to an apology and a request, not a demand, that they leave the city, which they did. And the missionaries, they then traveled to Thessalonica, where some Jews instigated an uproar against them and dragged Jason before the authorities and accusing Jason of harboring and sympathizing with these known social disruptors, these who are turning the world upside down. And to that general accusation, they added the charge that they were acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there's another king, somebody named Jesus. And so that obviously creates an environment of danger and murder. And so given that danger, the brothers then sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching in Berea, they went there with the same strategy of opposition that it had been effective for them in Thessalonica. They turned the crowds there in Berea against the missionaries, which led to Paul then being sent to the coast, where he boarded a vessel and sailed to Athens. And Timothy and Silas remained in Berea. And then in Athens, you'll recall that some philosophers, Paul was there teaching about Jesus in synagogue in the marketplace. Some philosophers brought Paul to the city's advisory council, a group known as the Areopagus. And when we ended, we were looking at Paul's address to that council, which Luke reports in Acts chapter 17, verses 22 to 34. Now, in his speech to the Areopagus, Paul says in verse 28, he quotes the Greek poet Aratus' statement that humans are God's offspring. As I mentioned, that would have meant something different for Paul than it meant for Aratus. But Paul can use the surface agreement. So you have Aratus saying that we are God's offspring. So Paul quotes that. And then he explains that since humans are God's offspring, as Aratus recognized, since humans are God's offspring, we ought not. It is wrong for us to conceive of God as idolaters conceive of God. It is wrong for us to do that, to think he's like an image made of gold or silver or stone that was formed by the art and imagination of man. And then that brings us to chapter 17, verse 30, which is right where we ended last week. And there in 17:30, Paul says, the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. And by times of ignorance, we hear that and we think, well, they weren't to blame, they just didn't know any better. That's not what he means. By times of ignorance, he's referring to a willful, culpable, blameworthy ignorance. He means the time in which Gentiles engaged in idol worship by suppressing what they ought to have known as God's offspring, namely that he is not like idol images, that he's not like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. They should know that. They ought to know that because they are God's offspring. They have to suppress that truth. That truth is innate. It is intuitive because of how we are created, that we perceive that we are creatures of God, and we must suppress that to engage in idolatry. And that's what he's talking about. It's culpable. This is the story of Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. Right? I mean, Paul says clearly there that idolatry, it involves culpable suppression of the truth that we are God's creatures. So when he says that, the times of ignorance, he's referring to that willful, culpable ignorance. And in saying God overlooked or disregarded that idolatry, Paul doesn't mean that God gives them a pass. No, he was okay with it. He was okay with their idolatry because they didn't know any better. So that's not what he's saying at all. It's not that he gave them a pass. It's not that he didn't hold the Gentiles accountable for the sin of idolatry. He means that he disregarded their idolatry in the sense that he did not allow their idolatry to disqualify them as potential objects of his mercy. He did not allow their idolatry to close the door of hope on them. He didn't do that. He disregarded it in that sense. On the contrary, despite their prior idolatry, he is now extending to them an offer of mercy in Christ to these Gentiles. These Gentiles who forever have engaged in idol worship, just like there in Athens. He didn't write them off because of that. He overlooked it. He didn't allow it to disqualify them as potential objects of his mercy. In fact, he's now offering them mercy in Jesus Christ. That's what he's doing here. He's giving them that offer of mercy. He commands all people everywhere, Gentile as well as Jew, to repent, to turn from their present way to his way, that they may be saved on the appointed day of judgment by Jesus Christ. See, he says, he commands all people everywhere to repent because he has fixed the day on which he's going to judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he's appointed. That man is Jesus. You see, so he's now extending mercy to them that they might be saved on that appointed day of judgment by Jesus Christ. And Paul says, God has given assurance to all. He's given assurance to all that Christ is his criterion of judgment. Christ is the basis of his judgment. One's relationship to Christ is what matters in the judgment. He has given assurance to all that Christ is his criterion of judgment by raising him from the dead. There's no secret about it. He has raised him from the dead to show he's the guy. He's the one. By raising him from the dead. Now, that reference to the resurrection, when Paul says that he raised Jesus from the dead, well, you have people, some of the hearers there, they mock the claim. Oh, I was listening to that. That's utter nonsense. Claiming that he raised a dead person, brought him back to life. That's what I. Howard Marshall says. He says, although Greeks believed in the immortality of the soul, the idea of a bodily resurrection was alien to their thinking, since the body was increasingly regarded as earthly and evil in comparison with the soul, which was the seat of the divine in man. Not only was the cross folly to Gentiles, but so also was the resurrection. And so Paul says he's given evidence, indication of this to all by raising him from the dead. And these people hear that and they just go, oh man. Some of them, they wind up mocking him. Now, others were at least more polite. They indicated that they were willing to hear Paul on another occasion talk about this. Whereas you had some people said, that's it, I'm out, you're a clown. Okay, other people more polite and said, we'll hear you on another occasion. But Luke notes that there were conversions there in Athens. He doesn't say there were a lot. But there were conversions in Athens, including Dionysius, who was a member of the Areopagus. There was a woman named Damaris and some others. Now, you may be thinking, you say, wait, now, they're here in Athens, and Athens is within the geographical province of Achaia. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 15, Paul describes the Corinthian household of Stephanas as the first fruits of Achaia, the first converts of Achaia. So if he had converts in Athens, which is in the province of Achaia, and then later has converts in Corinth, but he calls those in Corinth the first fruits, isn't Paul wrong? Well, as you know, the answer to that is no. Okay, he's not. Here's what Keener says. He says, more important from the standpoint of Roman administration is that Athens was one of a handful of free cities, independent governing cities. He says, excluded from the province of Achaia until the time of Constantine I. So until the beginning of the 4th century, it was a free city. And he says, Athenian converts would not then need to be counted technically among Paul's first converts in the province of Achaia, certainly not in a letter to Corinthians. Okay? If I have an angle that allows me to exclude these people from being converts in Achaia, and I'm writing to the church in Corinth, you can see, I'd say, well, they were the first fruits in Achaia. And I could do that honestly, and I would have a motive to do it. Okay, and he says, we therefore lack grounds to doubt Luke's report of converts there. That's just a little footnote for I know how you work. You hear this and you go, what? Well, how does that fit with that? So I'm trying to arm you for that in the future. Okay, it seems from other texts that Silas and Timothy, or maybe just Timothy, Silas or Timothy, maybe just Timothy, they joined Paul in Athens. You remember, Paul went to Athens. He left Silas and Timothy in Berea. And he sent word back with the people who'd accompany him and said, hey, tell these guys to come to me when they can. And so Paul, or Timothy and Silas, or maybe just Timothy, joined Paul there in Athens. And then Paul dispatches Timothy back to Macedonia, but to Thessalonica. And we see that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 1 to 3. He sends Timothy back there because he's concerned about the Thessalonians in the midst of persecution. So he dispatches him back there. Now if Silas was with Timothy when he came, if only Timothy came and Silas stayed in Berea, Paul dispatches Timothy back to Thessalonica, and then they come and join him. They're going to join him in Corinth. But if Silas was there, then he also dispatched Silas to somewhere else in Macedonia. And then Paul left Athens to go to Corinth. He leaves Athens to go to Corinth, which is that's the capital of Achaia. And you see them all, you know, where we're up here, right? So he sailed down to Athens. He comes up here. Timothy comes down. He dispatches Timothy to go back up to Thessalonica. And then Paul goes over to Corinth. And then Silas and Timothy join Paul in Corinth, as it says in verse 5. So he gets to Corinth, and then we have from Macedonia, Silas and Timothy join Paul there. And the three of them, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, they are said to have preached Christ among the Corinthians. You see that in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 9. So that's where we are. So he gets joined there. And then Paul's condition when he arrived in Corinth. If you followed Paul, that's kind of why I recapped what had happened quickly, just focusing on the hardship and the persecution as he's gone along this leg here. It's just really difficult. But his condition when he arrived, it's reflected in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 3, where he says, I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. And Richard Longnecker, he says, Paul's in a dejected mood. He's burdened by the problems in Macedonia. Those problems he sent Timothy, dispatched him up to Thessalonica because he's got word of what's going on up there. He's burdened by those things and by his dismissal at Athens, though he had converts there. He was treated in a less than stellar fashion there in Athens. But more than that, I just think about all that he's endured from Philippi on. I mean, he's being hounded and threatened with death and people hating him all over the place. And you can see how that just wears on you. Everywhere I go and I'm going to present this life-saving message of God. And then these forces just, they come after me, just baring their teeth and trying to destroy me. And, Paul's he's a man. This is grueling. And so when he writes that, I came to Corinth, I understand what's happening there. And there in Corinth, he met a Jewish Christian couple, Aquila and Priscilla, who had recently come to Corinth. This is after Emperor Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome. So though they're Jewish Christians, and Luke doesn't give that detail there, we know they're Christians, and undoubtedly, or almost certainly they're Christians already, because he would have reported their conversion later. So here they are, Priscilla and Aquila. They've been expelled from Rome by the edict of Emperor Claudius. And you say, well, they're Christians, but he's not going to distinguish. He says, all Jews in Rome out. And so Priscilla and Aquila being Jewish, out they go. And like Paul, they were tent makers or leather workers. And Paul stayed with them. He stayed with them and he supplied and supported. He stayed with them and he supported himself by working with them. So he's paying his way. He's laboring at tent making or leather working. And that's what he's doing. As Marshall says, since rabbis were expected to perform their religious and legal functions without demanding a fee, it was necessary for them to have some other source of income. Paul's occupation was as a tent maker. Paul had a trade. Paul had a skill where he could earn money. And so that's what he's doing when he comes to Corinth. He finds Priscilla and Aquila, who are tent makers, leather workers, and Paul is also. So he stays with them and he works during that time. Now the Roman historian Suetonius, you say, what's up with this expulsion? The Roman historian, a man named Suetonius, he lived from AD 69 to AD 140. Okay, so you can kind of put that in where we are. But he's a Roman historian, and he reports that the Roman Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome because they were constantly rioting. The Jews were, quote, rioting at the instigation of Chrestus. They were rioting at the instigation of Chrestus. Now, most scholars agree that Suetonius's Chrestus is a misspelling of the Greek Christos, Christ. And that the reference is probably to disputes, heated disputes that were going on in the Jewish community over the claims of Jesus to be the Christos, to be the Messiah. So within the Jewish community in Rome, there was, quote, rioting at the instigation of Chrestus. There were these intense arguments going on about, is Jesus the Christ? And so it got so bad that the Roman emperor said, all you Jews who are causing me trouble here, you people who are rioting at the instigation of Chrestus, out. And so he expelled the Jews from Rome, and that's what led Priscilla and Aquila to Corinth. So Paul meets him. And that expulsion by Emperor Claudius was in the year 49. So this is one of the little chronology markers. That was in 49 that they were expelled. Now, Aquila and Priscilla, as you know, and as we'll see, they later accompanied Paul to Ephesus, where they remained. They go with Paul to Ephesus. They remain there while Paul continued back to Syrian Antioch. And when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians from Ephesus, so Priscilla and Aquila go with him to Ephesus. Paul then continues on to Syrian Antioch. Later, when Paul writes 1 Corinthians from Ephesus around AD 54, he sent greetings to the Corinthians from Priscilla and Aquila and the church in their house. And you see that in 1 Corinthians 16:19. Now, when Paul wrote Romans several years later, AD 57, the couple's back in Rome. You see that in Romans chapter 16, verse 3. And the expulsion, you say, well, how do they get back to Rome? Well, Claudius kicked him out, but that edict of expulsion ceased to be in force once Claudius died, and Claudius died in AD 54. So he says all the Jews out, he dies, edict over, and then you have Priscilla and Aquila who find their way back to Rome by the time Paul writes Romans in AD 57. But then in the mid-60s, they're back in Ephesus. They're back in Ephesus, that being Timothy's probable location when Paul wrote 2 Timothy, and you see that in 2 Timothy 4:19. So you just see something of the mobility of at least certain classes of Christians in antiquity. So we have Priscilla and Aquila, they're in Rome, then they're in Corinth, then they're in Ephesus, then they're in Rome, then they're in Ephesus. Okay, so they're moving around, but obviously they're going to these churches and these Christian centers. Now, every Sabbath, Paul tried in Corinth. Every Sabbath, Paul tried to persuade the Jews and Greeks in the synagogue about the truth of the gospel. That's what Paul's about, right? Paul is trying to persuade people, say, listen, you got to see this. He's the Messiah. And so he's trying, he's blowing his mind. He got this resistance he's getting, and he's going, no, he's the Messiah. Why don't you recognize that? But he's there trying to persuade Jews and Greeks there. And when Silas and Timothy, when they arrived from Macedonia, you remember whether it was just Timothy who came first and was dispatched back, or both of them came and they're both dispatched, but then he's in Corinth, and they then arrive from Macedonia, and one or both of them bring financial assistance for Paul from the congregation in Philippi and possibly elsewhere. You can see that in Philippians 4:15 and 2 Corinthians 11:8 and 9. So now he's got some funds, right? Before this, he's tied up working. He's still preaching like, all he can, but he has to be working to earn his way. Well, now he's got some contribution from assistance from brothers and sisters, so that frees him up so he can teach more. So that allows him to do some more teaching, and so he can more fully devote himself more fully to preaching to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. Okay, so he has more time doing it. And the Jews, they opposed and defamed or reviled Paul. So Paul now, he has more time to do it. He's doubling, tripling his efforts to persuade them that the Christ is in fact Jesus. And the response here, that they oppose him and they defame him, revile him, they hated him. And he's a real person. And this isn't easy for anybody to endure. But this is what they do, and they did it with such intensity that his continuing to teach in the synagogue, it was no longer possible or feasible. The hostility had just become so great. It was such an obstacle to him to being able to try to appeal to them that it was no longer possible. He couldn't do it. And here's what Marshall says. He says, Paul responded by leaving the synagogue, but not before he had done his best to convince the Jews of the seriousness of their plight in rejecting the gospel. As on an earlier occasion, he shook the dust off his garments, Nehemiah 5:13, as a sign of the breaking off of fellowship with them. This kind of action was performed by Jews against Gentiles, and its present significance was to indicate that in the sight of the missionaries, those who rejected the gospel were no better than the Gentiles, cut off from the true people of God. You see, and that's what I've said to you many times, that you have ethnic Israel, but within ethnic Israel is true Israel. It is the Israel of the faith of Abraham. And in rejecting what God has testified to about his son, you are rejecting God and showing yourself that you do not have the faith of Abraham. Therefore, you are not part of true Israel. You have exposed and revealed yourself to be only ethnic Israel, not true Israel. Marshall finishes, he says, if the Jews found themselves ultimately rejected by God, the blame for this would rest entirely on themselves. Paul had preached faithfully to them and bore no responsibility for what they did with the message. From this point onwards, he was justified in bothering no more with them and turning instead to the Gentiles, both proselytes and others. So this is what's happened here in Corinth. Paul had been preaching. He'd been preaching a lot. He'd been preaching, overtime, really at it. They hated him. They reviled him, and they got so hostile toward him that he could not continue in that particular avenue of his ministry. So Paul, what does he do? He sets up his teaching ministry next door to the synagogue in the home of Titius Justus. So he goes next door to the home of this fellow Titius Justus. Now, Titius Justus, he's described as a worshiper of God, which is practically a technical term for God-fearers. That group I was telling you about of Gentiles who were devotees of Judaism, who worshiped the God, who were very interested in Judaism, but who had not yet become proselytes. They had not been circumcised and committed themselves to obeying all the Mosaic law. So that is who this person was. And since he makes his house available as the new center of Christian preaching and teaching, you can infer that he was somebody who, as a God-fearer, had heard Paul in the synagogue and had converted to Christ. So much so that he's now willing to make his home available as the center for that preaching and teaching. And so that's who this fellow is. Now, some have suggested that his full Roman name was Gaius Titius Justus, and that he was Paul's host in Corinth when Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. And all you can say is that's possible, but it's really hard to pin something like that down. Now, Paul's ministry, his ministry in Corinth, it was very successful. Many who heard him preach, many of them believed and were baptized, including Crispus. Including Crispus, you see, who was the ruler of the synagogue and his entire household. Now, it's interesting. We know Crispus, his baptism is mentioned expressly in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 14. So here we have this convert. And you see how Paul, or Luke here, he says, Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. You say, well, Luke doesn't say he was baptized. Well, because Luke, from the whole thing he's writing, everybody knows that when you come to penitent faith in Jesus, the response God calls you to is to submit to immersion in Christ's name. He doesn't have to say it all the time. We know for a fact Crispus was baptized because Paul says it in 1 Corinthians. You see, so that's how this works. It was understood. Everybody understood it. He says, believe in the Lord together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians hearing Paul believed and were baptized. So we have them here, many of them. Now, Crispus's conversion, right? His conversion was no doubt disturbing to the Jews. You can see that, right? They're losing their minds about Paul. So much so that Paul has to say, I can't even talk to you people anymore. You're ridiculous. Your hatred for me is blinding you. That I have to go elsewhere. I have to set up shop somewhere else. And now the ruler of the synagogue becomes a Christian? Oh, that wouldn't have gone over well. And you can imagine the impact that had. Right? The ruler of the synagogue, somebody that we all recognize, if anybody knows what's going on in the Jewish faith, is this dude. And he says, you know what? Paul's spot on. Jesus is the Christ. And you can see this would have had a big impact, and it would have led to other conversions. So his conversions really start snowballing and growing. Now, Paul, from past experience, he could anticipate that with greater evangelistic success comes greater opposition. Right? So Paul knows from what's going on, he knows the face of the enemy. He knows what the enemy hates. And as Paul is being more and more effective, aided by the conversion of the ruler of the synagogue, you can see Paul sitting here getting careful or nervous or saying, I know what's coming now. I know the harder and the more I take advantage of these opportunities, the greater the enemy's going to rage against me. And I think that's why God appears to him now and supports him, reassures him in this nighttime vision. And he tells him, do not be afraid, but go on speaking and do not be silent, for I am with you. And no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. See, he commands Paul to continue preaching because God obviously knows in advance how successful the gospel is going to be in that city. There are many in that city who are going to convert. God knows that. and to steel Paul for that task. As things are going to intensify even beyond what they are because of his increasing effectiveness, he promises that he will protect him from harm, that he may continue the mission. He says, I've sent you, you're my agent. There are many people here who are going to convert. You keep at it. You keep at it. I want you to talk to everybody. And I will protect you. Now, it would be nice to have that. I have to say, it would be nice to have a vision from the Lord saying, hey, I'm going to protect you. You keep going. You keep going. But that doesn't mean it's not difficult to keep going in the face of these kinds of threats and hostility. And Paul taught the Word of God in Corinth for about 18 months. And the Lord's promise to protect him, it's demonstrated in the attempt of the Jews to bring legal charges against him before Gallio, who was the Roman proconsul of Achaia from July 51 to June 52. Now, this is a very important thing because we have this very narrow window when we know from other sources when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. And so that is one of the sure chronological pegs of Paul's life. One of the absolute markers you see. Instead of a relative thing, we have an absolute date. And from that, we can then work backwards and forward. So it's a very important date here. But Gallio here, he's proconsul. And specifically, they charged Paul before this proconsul of Achaia. They charged him with persuading people to worship God contrary to the law, meaning contrary to the Roman law. That's what he's talking about. It seems they're claiming that, look, the religion for which Paul is advocating. You say, well, what does it make any sense to say that he's preaching contrary to the Roman law? How would that make sense? Well, they're claiming that the religion for which Paul is advocating, these Jews are saying, look, this is something new. And this is not something that is part of the legally protected religion of Judaism. You see, Judaism had protection in the Roman society. It was a known ancient thing. And so what they're trying to do, they're trying to throw Paul under the bus by saying, this is different. This is something new. It is outside the protection of Roman law for Judaism. He's offering a new religion. And therefore, he's preaching contrary to the law. And so they bring him, that's what they're saying, to bring him before Gallio. It's an illegal religion. That's what they're claiming. And they want Gallio to declare it as such. And then we can have at him. But Gallio, however, he perceives the complaint. They're saying, no, this is an illegal religion. This is not Judaism at all. And Gallio perceives it, you see, as an intramural fight. He perceives it as a battle, theological disagreements within Judaism. That's how he looks at it, so much so that he rules on the matter. Paul doesn't even have to say anything. He looks at this and says, this is a religious dispute and therefore not something subject to Roman courts. This is not something that is justiciable. It is not something you can bring for a Roman court to decide. This is an interreligion battle, and I'm not getting dragged into it, and I'll have nothing to do with it. And so that's what he winds up saying. And he dismisses the case out of hand. Paul doesn't even have to speak. Says Paul was about to open his mouth, and Gallio said, not necessary. I'm ruling, I'm kicking this thing out because this thing's ridiculous. It's a religious dispute. And he expels the Jews from his presence. He kicks them out. Okay, so here they are. They're bringing Paul. They're on the offensive. They're coming. They're before the proconsul. They say, this guy is an illegal religion. Jump him. And he says, this is crazy. Out, and you guys get out. Here's what Eckhart Schnabel says. This was an immensely important verdict, not only because it protected the Christians in the province of Achaia from legal cases against their beliefs and against the existence of their new congregations, but also because this was the first time that a Roman official issued a legal verdict concerning the followers of Jesus. This verdict declared that they should be regarded as a Jewish group, with the corollary that they would have the right to the same legal privileges that the Jews had been granted by the emperors. So this was indeed significant. This was something that's very, very significant. Now, when the Jews who are present, this is probably, it could go Jews or Gentiles, but I think more likely, when the Jews who were present, when they realized that the case they were bringing, they were all excited about, this is going to be the victory. This is going to be, they hated Paul. This is going to be what we're after. We're going to have legal approval to pound him. Now, when those Jews who brought that case, when it was disallowed, and Paul and his group, they were given by implication official legal sanction. Well, now they're chapped. They're angry at whoever had the nerve to bring this stupid case. Because what happened is you slit our own throat, you brought a case against him, and now it's bounced back on us. Now he's got legal sanction, he's got legal approval. What is wrong with you? I thought you were smarter than that. It's just like when somebody brings a case today. People are looking for something, it turns around and goes against them. Everybody's mad at who brought it. You were stupid to bring that case. You should have foreseen what was going to happen. And so they didn't like it, so they wind up pounding on this guy. They turned on Sosthenes. Now Sosthenes, he is the current ruler of the synagogue. And he was no doubt instrumental in bringing the case against Paul. He was probably the point man, the spokesman. So here he is. So now he's the focus of their ire, that this case that has been brought, that has bounced back on us. And so you have this Jewish ruler of the synagogue who is now beaten, and they beat him right in front of the tribunal, and Gallio, of course, doesn't care. This Roman proconsul, what do I care? So they beat him there, angry with him, and he doesn't care a whit, as you might imagine. So now it's possible that Sosthenes was beaten by Gentiles. It doesn't tell us who's beating, but it's possible. I think more likely the Jews who are really angry that he's done this and didn't have the foresight not to bring this action. But it could have been Gentiles who took the occasion of Gallio's snub of the Jews. You see, when he says, look, no, I'm not hearing this thing, get out. So then they were emboldened by the proconsul's snub of the Jews to vent their anti-Semitism. You see, so that may be it, or it could be a combination. But in any event, you wind up having Sosthenes get pounded. And it is interesting that a Sosthenes is identified in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1, as the co-author of that letter to the Corinthian church. Now that is interesting, right? I. Howard Marshall says the possibility that Crispus's successor, you remember Crispus converted. Well, it's possible that Crispus's successor as ruler of the synagogue, Sosthenes, was also converted to Christianity. That can't be ruled out. Okay, well maybe that's the case. Can't prove that. All right, but that's something that I think is interesting. Perhaps Gallio's ruling, his treatment by fellow Jews. You see, when Gallio made that ruling, how he was treated by his fellow Jews, and Paul's continuing preaching, I can see that opening Sosthenes' eyes up. Maybe you say, well, what is this? Let me think about that. Okay. So, like I said, you can't prove that, but. So Paul then remains in Corinth an unspecified number of days. It really says an adequate or sufficient number of days without specifying. So he remains there an unspecified number of days after that Gallio decision, which may suggest that he had a short stay there in addition to the 18 months that's noted in chapter 18, verse 11. And he then, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila, he went to nearby Cenchreae to board a ship to return to Antioch in Syria. Okay, so this is where he's going. He goes here from Corinth, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila, to Cenchreae, boards a ship. Paul's headed over here to Antioch of Syria, but they're going to first sail to Ephesus. But you see here, Luke notes that in Cenchreae, Paul cut his hair because he was making a vow. You see, and the rendering making a vow, taking the imperfect that way, he was making a vow. Some translations say he did it because he was under a vow, and that gives you the impression that he's cutting his hair because he's completing a vow, and I think that's wrong. I think what Paul is doing is in anticipation of taking on a Nazirite vow, that he cuts his hair in anticipation of that. Now, opinions vary on that, but at Cenchreae, what he does, he cuts his hair. He doesn't shave his head. They're different words. He cuts his hair, gives himself a haircut, instead of shave his head, as you see in 21:24. I think what he's doing, it's in advance, in anticipation of making a Nazirite vow in gratitude for God's blessings and protection in Corinth. Remember, God appeared to him, says, I'm going to protect you here. Paul's there a long time. I think Paul's making a Nazirite vow in appreciation and gratitude for the protection that God had given him in Corinth, and knowing, how long is it going to be until I cut my hair again? He's traveling to Syria and Antioch, but knowing the vagaries of travel in the ancient world, especially when you're somebody like Paul who never knows what's going to happen to him, in anticipation of not cutting my hair for who knows how long, Paul cuts his hair so that it will be that much shorter. All right, he won't have to, he doesn't know how long it's going to be until he can cut it again, until he shaves it. Until he shaves his head in completion of the vow, which he does at the temple in Jerusalem. That's what was required under Numbers chapter 6. Of course, Numbers is talking about the tabernacle, but that was transferred to the temple in Jerusalem. So what I think is going on is Paul cuts his hair in anticipation of making a Nazirite vow, because he doesn't know how long it will be until he gets to Jerusalem to shave his head at the temple in fulfillment of that Nazirite vow pursuant to number 6. Okay, so it's just anticipatory. He winds up, and as I say, if you look at as Luke Timothy Johnson says, in this case, the translation of the imperfect, he was making a vow. So he gives himself a haircut, cuts his hair in anticipation he was making a vow, not that he was already under the vow. All right. Now, Paul's personal decision, if I'm right about this, he's making a Nazirite vow where he will ultimately cut his hair at the temple. Now, Paul's personal decision to make a Nazirite vow doesn't mean, as you well know, it doesn't mean that Paul believed the Mosaic law continued in force or that it was binding on a Christian. His taking a Nazirite vow, it reflected his understanding that Jews of that day, those who were caught, they're really persistent. They know. He said, he's going to keep talking. I know he is. Well, this is how this works. I'm right at a place I'd like to explain things, but Lord willing, I'll do it next week. Thanks.